And for inviting me to speak. Very interesting presentations by both the panelists so far. Anthony, I just looked up your company's website and I noticed that you've hired one of my students, Rasib Banji. He was in my class.
Yes.
So if he is good,
Yes.
it's because of all BAV is a course he took in the spring of 2018. If he's bad, it's all those finance courses he must have taken.
I think he was in the next class too.
Maybe. I've taken a slightly different angle on this, and I'm focusing more, I guess, similar to the second presentation, not on the fact that investors may or may not be using a different summary measure, but more on the kind of non-financial measures that people are using and what academic research says on that. But before I start my presentation, I just wanted to add a couple of additional points, just things which came up in my mind based on the prior presentation. Anthony raised a lot of interesting points about the fact that people are fixated on a single measure. There's a lot of academic research on it. So for those of you who are interested, just Google the word functional fixation. Okay, the fact that people just fixate on a given number, and if people fixate on a number, obviously managers and everybody is going to manipulate that particular number. That's exactly what happens. And I actually had a paper published in the Accounting Review a few years ago. This is not even about this recognition versus disclosure, like whether it's on the income statement, whether it's off the income statement. We looked at an accounting standard change in the US where the accounting for the gains and losses which come with debt retirements, the accounting standards changed. It used to be considered an extraordinary item, so it was below the line. And the accounting standards changed, so it was no longer an extraordinary item, so it became above the line. So this is just a question of income statement geography. It's like it used to be on line 15, now it's on line 10. Above and below the line, and it completely changed the way investors use the information. So as these gains and losses, which used to have no relevance, no earnings response coefficient and stuff, suddenly started becoming relevant. And investors treated them as though these have cash flow implications, even though they didn't. And not surprisingly, there's been follow-on research which shows that this has also changed the way companies use these debt retirements, because they're far more likely to use them to deliver a financial statement reporting goal. Especially if they need to increase or decrease their earnings. So I just thought that was interesting. And also regarding the non-GAAP measures and how people use them about web hits and so on and so forth, one of our colleagues, Franco Wong, had one of the early papers, and this paper is entitled "The Eyeballs Have It." It's about how internet firms were being valued on web activity, not on profits because those are non-existent, not on revenues because those are also sometimes non-existent, but on web activity, which was considered a leading indicator of revenues, which was considered a leading indicator of profits, and we all know how that worked out. So, all right. So let me move on to my presentation. So I'm the current John H. Watson Chair, as has been mentioned, taking over from Eric just a few months ago. I'm also the area coordinator for our accounting area, and I'm also the director of an institute called the...
This should work.
Oh, okay. They're pretty low tech. Okay. So let me just talk about non-financial measures. If you think about non-financial measures, right, there are different ways you can classify them, but I thought it might be useful to classify them in one of two ways. One is, what is the purpose of the measure? Sometimes you can have non-financial measures whose purpose is inherently financial, right? But you could also have non-financial measures which may not have at least immediate financial implications, and still people might care about those, okay? That's one way of classifying it, and I'll elaborate on each of these in a second. You can also look at who is providing the measure. Is it being provided by the firm? Or is it being provided by financial intermediaries? Or is it being provided by investors themselves? And in what format? Is it being provided as a part of existing disclosure? Is it being provided as additional standalone disclosure? Or is it being provided in other means? For example, social media. I'll talk about that briefly because I have a paper on that as well, a recent paper as well. Okay, so let's talk about the first thing. Better prediction of financials. Okay, so assume that investors fundamentally care about the prediction of future financials, or which could be accounting fundamentals or stock returns, either or. Obviously, the two will be correlated, hopefully. So prediction of financial measures can be improved by non-financial metrics. So what are some examples? Okay, things like, here are some examples, right? Order book position, customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, human capital, IP-related information, patents and so on. So there's been a vast literature which has shown that these measures are indeed value relevant, and investors pay attention to them, even not perfectly. Sometimes they can overreact, which leads to reversals. In some cases, they underreact, which leads to a drift. But the fact is, these things are value relevant. So there has been consequently two schools of thought on the academic side as to whether these kind of disclosures should be made mandatory or should they remain voluntary as they currently are. So if you talk to my former colleague, Baruch Lev at NYU, he's been arguing for years that accounting no longer measures what's important, right? And you should have more of these kinds of disclosures in the financial statements. The counter-argument, and there's an interesting paper by a bunch of academics, but it was more of a practitioner paper in the Accounting Horizons, 2002 by Maines et al., which says that this disclosure should be voluntary. There are lots of concerns about, let's say, proprietary costs. Some firms might be happy to disclose them, and other firms might not want to disclose them. And there's inherent concerns about reliability. Relevance may be there, but reliability can be pretty low, and certainly these can also be manipulated. So essentially, the argument here is companies which want to disclose them are disclosing them. Investors have the ability, using their own mechanisms, maybe intermediaries can help, to decide whether these things are credible or not. Why should we give these things a sort of good housekeeping seal of approval for putting them as part of financial statements? Let them remain, or putting them as part of the mandated financial statements. Let these things remain voluntary. Okay. You could also consider measures which do not have immediate financial implications. So what are some examples? So measures that capture other things that investors care about: corporate citizenship, socially responsible investing. So examples: environmental disclosures, things about sustainability, environmental stewardship, climate change, social, poverty, income inequality, workers' rights, working conditions, governance, just a subset, example, things like gender and racial diversity in the workplace, top leadership, boards, etc. Okay? So there has been some research which shows that the usefulness of these measures depends largely on the context. And the context here is the nature of the economy. Are you in a stakeholder maximization kind of economy, or are you in a shareholder maximization kind of economy? So if you think about the European economies like Germany and many of the Asian countries have more of a stakeholder maximization view. The US is probably far more on the shareholder maximization view. I'd say Canada somewhere in between, probably a little closer to the US than to the rest of the world, but certainly some stakeholder concerns come in here as well. So there's an interesting paper actually by one of my colleagues and a couple of our former doctoral students called "Is Sin a Sin? The Interaction Effects of Social Norms and Financial Incentives on Market Participants' Behavior." So what these people look at in this paper is they look at how the market looks at sin stocks. And by sin stocks, they're referring to stocks in things like gambling, alcohol, tobacco, and I think they may look at firearms as well, I'm not sure. And what they show is the valuation of these stocks depends on what the social norms for those things and how they've changed across time. So for example, gambling used to be considered really bad, but social norms towards gambling have generally been changing, while the norms towards tobacco and alcohol have probably gone the other way. Interesting experiment is that we probably have a future research project looking at how marijuana stocks are going to look like in the next few years, given the issues with legalization and so on in Canada. So anyway, so who provides non-financial information? It could be the firm itself. So potentially as voluntary disclosure as part of the annual reports, for example, and order backlog and so on. It could be like standalone CSR disclosures, for example, put out by companies, where the company essentially has to trade off the benefits against the costs. So the benefits obviously are less information asymmetry, especially if these non-financial measures alleviate information asymmetry. you appeal to socially conscious investors, and there's been a sort of rise in the socially responsible investing. You also appear less risky. You appear better prepared to face future eventualities, whether it be global warming, future regulations, and so on and so forth. The costs. There are costs. The biggest cost, I think, that the literature is focused a lot on is proprietary costs. The fact that by being more transparent, you're being more transparent to everyone, including your competitors, including regulators, who probably can look at you much more closely than you would want them to look at you. So, you also risk giving the appearance of greenwashing. That is, you're somebody who just says this but doesn't really follow through or doesn't really mean this. I saw a brilliant example of that recently. So I drive an EV. And lest you think that professors are overpaid, it's a Chevy Bolt, not a Tesla. Anyway, so Home Depot introduced EV charging, but EV charging at Home Depot was just a plug. Like they literally had a plug, like with a 110 volt with orange thing saying EV charging. As opposed to if you go to some of the places, they actually have a nice charger. If you drive to Pearson, if you go to the cell phone lot, you can charge your EV for free at DC and stuff. So to me, that's an example of greenwashing, where technically, yes, they are looking for the environment, but it'll take 3 days for your car to charge, Or if you're in Home Depot for an hour, you'll get half a kilowatt of charge or something. Anyway, the need to follow through. You make these disclosures. Hopefully, somebody's keeping track. And the last thing is, this might actually hurt you with the purely financially focused investor. The person who says that, all this is fine, but you're wasting your time doing all this stuff. I'm focusing on earnings and cash flows. Intermediaries. So analysts, there's been a growth in analysts who actually focus on non-financial information. So I remember at Rotman, we had this working paper presentation by a foreign scholar who talked about CSR analysts a couple of years ago. Investors themselves. So I'm going to talk about that briefly. The rise of social media, this notion of wisdom of crowds, and also crowdsourced research. You have people, you have Seeking Alpha, where people put out their own crowdsourced reports. And then you have this awesome new website. I encourage some of you who haven't looked at it to look at it, called Estimize, which essentially is crowdsourced equity research in terms of crowdsourced forecasts, where people essentially can follow firms and put their own forecasts of firms, and you get a consensus. And it's a very intelligent platform because they essentially weight the consensus based on your prior accuracy. So it's a sort of self-correcting, almost like a learning crowdsourced platform. So I'll talk about wisdom of crowds based on my own research. So I have this paper called Can Twitter Help Predict Firm-Level Earnings and Stock Returns, just published recently in the Accounting Review. So essentially what we did was, we looked at tweets by ordinary investors. We're not looking at tweets by the firms, by the, someone like Veritas who actually knows what they're talking about. We're talking about just ordinary investors, like the hundreds and thousands of them, in the time period leading up to earnings announcements. And we did some sort of lexical analysis to gauge the sentiment of each tweet, whether it's positive or negative or neutral. And we had two ways of doing it. One was a dichotomous way, one was a more continuous way of doing it. And we sort of aggregate this at the firm level to say that, what, Apple is putting out its earnings announcements, and people tend to be a little pessimistic about Apple. So the tweets could be financial in nature, maybe non-financial in nature. It could be someone saying that, hey, I saw the line outside the Apple store for the new iPhone XS release, and the lines appear a little shorter this time. So I don't think this is a blockbuster product or something like that. So we can create this aggregate Twitter sentiment, and we see if this aggregate Twitter sentiment predicts earnings surprise and whether it has any relevance for returns and earnings, for returns. And what we find is that aggregate Twitter sentiment predicts the earnings surprise. So if on average investors are positive about the firm in the period leading up to the earnings announcement, the firm is more likely to have a positive earnings surprise, and vice versa. And more importantly, it predicts the returns around the earnings surprise, because just you can predict the earnings surprise, but if the market's already got that information through other sources, you're just providing correlated information which has no additional value. We find that this also predicts the direction of the returns around the earnings surprise. So this is not only relevant information, this is incrementally relevant information which the market hasn't got through other sources. And the last and most interesting finding in our opinion is we found these effects are much stronger for firms in weaker information environments. So for firms where the existing information environment, either the firm's own quality of disclosure or the ecosystem of analysts and institutional investors and all is weaker, smaller firms for instance, less press coverage, these results are even stronger. And this works both for original tweets as well as disseminating tweets. So the tweets could be people putting, like the one I just mentioned, somebody talking about his or her experience in the Apple store, or somebody saying, hey, Veritas has put out a report on Apple and it's very, very positive or negative. So it could be a disseminating tweet as well. And so essentially shows that Twitter has this dual role, both as a provider of information as well as a disseminator of existing information. So despite concerns about bias and manipulation, and we all know that social media can do dramatic things, like elect a president, for instance. So, so in spite of that, I'm a US citizen, by the way, who didn't vote for Donald Trump. Anyway, so, okay, despite concerns about bias and manipulation, it seems to have a lot of relevance. Okay, so what are the implications of all of this for value investors? Firstly, this is I do a lot of research on investing, trying to identify, looking at strategies to generate alpha and so on and so forth. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to generate alpha. Okay, in fact, people have shown that many of these return predictors, the risk premiums have dramatically declined in the last 10 or 15 years. Many of these so-called anomalies and everything is weakened. Okay, so what are the reasons for it? One is, despite all the concerns which were raised, markets are generally becoming more efficient. And investors are using financial-based indicators. And so maybe these non-financial indicators may become relevant in the search for alpha. However, some concerns do remain. Okay, one of them is credibility of information. Utility of information versus trend chasing. It's always very hot to say that, okay, this is what matters. You know, this is the thing we should be focusing on. And then 3 years later, you move on to something else because that's kind of passé or it's no longer that interesting. And in the long run, and this goes back to this whole Graham and Dodd thing, right? A good investment has to be justified in terms of future cash flows. So you either need to have better cash flows, so you think, or worse if you're shorting, you know, that is, it's a numerator effect that, you know, things that you have looked at tell you that this firm is going to have better cash flows. Or it has to be a denominator effect. That is, based on everything you see, this firm is less risky than the market thinks it is. Okay? So, I think it may be interesting to look beyond firm-provided disclosures to other avenues, you know, social media and cloud source platforms and so on. Okay? So that's all I have to say. I'll be happy to hand it over to Eric and to the rest of you for any questions. Thank you.